By the 1830s, the ultimate American ambition was simple: acquire enough land and resources that absolutely nothing could threaten your family's physical or financial survival. For James and Cynthia McClellan, a married couple in their early 30s living in Shelby County, Illinois, that dream was a reality. They had successfully wrestled the frontier into submission. Their estate was immense, a massive 700-acre property featuring 600 acres of farmland and 100 acres of timber. They had cabins, smokehouses, and corn cribs. Surplus hogs, cattle, and crops were shipped to supply the booming markets of Chicago and St. Louis. In May of 1839, that stability shifted. They were baptized into the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a commitment that immediately realigned their priorities away from the Illinois soil they had spent years cultivating. Together with the main body of the church, they liquidated their empire. They sold off their vast acreage, converting solid, generational wealth into travel wagons, cash, and shares in church buildings, and relocated to the religious settlement of Nauvoo. Why would a family voluntarily incinerate a fortress of physical and financial security for an abstract belief? And exactly what kind of toll does a decision like that extract? The consequences of their relocation were brutal and immediate. Upon arriving in Nauvoo, both James and Cynthia were stricken by severe rheumatism. The physical pain confined them entirely to their beds for 3 unbroken months. With the adults incapacitated, the burden of managing their remaining wealth, 60 head of cattle, fell to their 13-year-old son, William. The herd scattered, attempting to migrate back to the old farm. By the time they were located, half the livestock were lost to the ice of a freezing river. The descent from plenty to extreme poverty was complete. To secure basic lumber just to survive the elements, James was forced to trade away their final yoke of oxen. Then came 1846, and the religious persecution that forced the McClellans into a mass exodus across the American West. Penniless, they had to quickly invent a way to fund a continental migration. James relied on his raw trade skills. Setting up a temporary operation along the Overland Trail, he worked as a blacksmith and gunsmith. By 1849, his makeshift shop was directly in the path of the sudden, massive wave of California gold rush prospectors. The gold hunters needed wagon repairs and fresh horseshoes. James provided the labor, and in return, he collected the cash and supplies, his family required to continue their own journey toward the Salt Lake Valley. Success on the trail depended on this marriage of religious devotion and mechanical skill, the ability to turn a blacksmith's hammer into a tool of survival. By the summer of 1850, the family finally had the resources to embark on the punishing trail toward the Salt Lake Valley, but wet weather left the trail littered with stagnant spring water. As their wagon company drank from these contaminated pools, a lethal outbreak of cholera swept through the camp. Within days, the disease claimed the life of James and Cynthia's 2-year-old son, Jimmy. The despair compounded quickly. Their 9-year-old daughter, Louisa Ann, contracted the infection and deteriorated so rapidly that the family sent riders ahead to the Vanguard Company with grim instructions: dig 2 graves instead of 1. Louisa miraculously survived the fever, but the sheer physical taxation on Cynthia was absolute. When she gave birth to her 11th child in the Black Hills of Wyoming, she was so utterly exhausted and starved by the trail that she could not produce milk to nurse her own infant. The true cost of their journey was no longer measured in acres, timber, or cattle. The toll was extracted directly from their own bodies and the lives of their children. In October of 1850, the exhausted family descended into the Salt Lake Valley, eventually settling in the town of Payson, Utah. They never attempted to rebuild the massive Illinois empire they had abandoned. Instead, James dedicated his remaining decades to community service, acting as the local blacksmith and a civic leader. Cynthia's body, worn down by decades of relentless exposure and hardship, gave out entirely. She died at the age of 52. James spent his later years heavily devoted to his faith's most sacred rituals. He traveled to southern Utah to perform proxy baptisms and endowments inside the newly constructed St. George Temple, securing the spiritual legacy he had prioritized over his material fortune. Decades later, a powerful piece of oral history was passed down to James's grandson. James claimed that back in Illinois, on the exact afternoon the church's founder, Joseph Smith, was assassinated, he and his son were out hoeing corn, and they watched their physical environment violently react. He described a sudden, frightening stillness. A blast of extreme heat rolled through the field, causing the leaves on the cornstalks to instantly droop, while the nearby trees wilted in a moment of sudden, overwhelming heat. The McClellan family history centers on that moment in the cornfield. To them, the physical world itself recognized their sacrifice, transforming the loss of their Illinois empire into a logical down payment on their eternal legacy.